this lecture is on the narrative aesthetics, framing, and fiction. We will be looking at classical Greece, frames and framing devices in this section, where the use of narration and storytelling is visible on the surface, mostly the surface on those types of objects. In the first class, we looked at the classical aesthetics through different cultures, different times, and so on. In the second class, we looked at glazed surfaces and its importance in ceramics. The previous session was on decoration, and this one is on specifically on narrative surfaces and the use of frames and framing. So I've shown you the Francois vase before in connections with classical form. Now we're going to look at it in relationship with narrative surface, because this wonderful vase has many scenes from the Trojan War telling you the development of that extraordinary story. So on the objects we find various parts of that story, and they are all assembled all over the form in a variety of position and framing devices and so on and so forth, and that's what we will be looking at in this lecture. So very often the articulation of forms is through banding on the form that creates sections into which various representational or narrative elements are inserted. We have the something similar happening in other cultures, where we have framing devices and boxes into which narrations are inserted, like we find in Egyptian wall painting prior to the Greek. But it is in Greek art that for the first time that logical sort of narrations are inserted in a credible fashion within the space of art, basically. In Egyptian representation, there is always a hierarchical use of space. Some elements are very large, others are small. There is very little overlapping of information. So it is not an experiential phenomenon as it happens on Greek vases. So the credible relation between subjects in representations on Greek vase is the first use of naturalistic spatial relations in art. And this precedence is notable, and it has led to the development of further form of representation in art, in painting, in sculpture, and in our times in photography and digital technology. But this credible relation between subjects in representations on Greek vases, being the first use of naturalistic spatial relations in art, is a precedence that is overlooked, that I want to correct today. So there is all kinds of strategic use of the vase as space to frame an image. You can have an image that goes all around the object in a 360-degree phenomenon, where you need to handle the wear and rotate it or move around it to experience the continuity of the narrative, which is what's happening on the image on the left. And another very interesting phenomenon is the distortion of space that happens when the frame is in relation to the form of the vase, that compresses the image. And this parallax distortion of space is something we also find in photography or in other lens-related form of image making. So this is an example here on two Panathenaec amphora. And again, like it's that wonderful relationship between form and image, 2D and 3D, image and object, that we find so specifically in ceramic history. We find these parallax distortions of space by convex form in China, as in the example on the left, and of course very often and commonly on Attic Greek pottery, as well as on other cultural ceramics that we will see later on. So on Greek Attic pottery, the narrative is often mythological. There are also domestic scenes, and like we've seen before by Amasis, this weaving and cloth making scenes scenes of daily life, scenes related to weddings and all kinds of events in the life of people. But what I want to stress here is how those objects are experienced by the way the image is inserted within the form, and how the relationship to the form and the image create a very specific experience, like in the case of this vase, a cinematic experience of fragmented image which develop as the object is rotated in space or as you move around it. And you can see that very clearly when on the photographic unrolling of the surface. You can see how the image is constructed on the vase, but the image appears static. While if you were to rotate the objects, you are embedded in the experience over time, and that creates a much more realistic or experiential experience of the event represented than would happen from a single glance, as happens in this image I am showing you. So there are all kinds of wonderful compositional devices used by Greek potters on their wares. You have, for example, circular composition that go towards the center of the form. You also have circular compositions with curved ground that creates a pressurized compression, like on the image on the right, where not only is the image in relation to the circle, but the circle sort of compresses the image and adds to the psychological intensity of what is represented here. So the way the Greek potters often use the edge and the circular images is very strategic as well, and creates a wonderful relationship between image and form, 2D and 3D, image and objects, and so on. And it creates an impression of movement in space, what I call active framing, by placing the foot of those figures on the left not on a flat ground but on a circular one. It creates an impression of movement and a dynamic impression of great efficiency. And you have the same thing on the right. Although the figures are inserted on a somewhat convincing flat surface and a horizontal ground, the foot of one of the characters hits the edge at the right of the circular composition in a way that is quite specific, and again creates a compression by the pressure of the foot that adds to the psychological nature again of the image represented, which is a scene of care between two friends. We have looked at the work of the Berlin painter in the classical aesthetics. Again, I'm showing you two examples of his very distinctive work where the form, the edge, the silhouette of the ware creates the frame over which the image operates. And that's quite exciting and specific to not only the work of the Berlin painter, but a lot of ceramic wares as well, where a representational image is inserted on the surface of the form. So this articulation between form and image finds all kinds of very exciting solutions in many ceramic objects, and I'm showing you two of them here where the form itself dictates where the image is located and how the image is in connections with the edge of the object on the left and the change in directions of the form on the right. In Greek art, often as well, we have two phenomena. One is elision, where some information is missing. For example, the figure on the left here is going into the ground, and his feet are missing to give us this impression that is penetrating the ground. While the ground itself is not represented, it is absent. And ellipsis, where something is not there. For example, again on the example on the right, all those figures are in space and in relation to one another, but there is no real ground on which they stand, and that's called ellipsis. So it may be interesting to remember those words. Elision, when information is missing, and ellipsis, when something is not there at all. So this is an example of elision here. If you look at the Minotaur that's represented in the figure, he is not there completely. half of his body is missing and disappears behind the wall. And again, this may seem like a very simple thing for us who are used to those kinds of disappearing acts in visual arts, but this was a first in graphic representation, in art making, and it is for the first time in Greek art that we find, and specifically in Greek Attic pottery of that time, that we find images represented partially instead of holistically. I have talked a little bit of performative framing before, but I bring it up again because it is a very interesting phenomenon. Those objects are not passive objects. They are meant to be used, and when you use them, something exciting happens. And they were used by the Greek in all kinds of activities. So when the calyx is filled with wine, and when tilted to drink the wine inside, the level of the wine reaches the boat at some point. And then the boat appears to be floating in the liquid, and the dolphins appear to be jumping out of the water, and this activates the object, and it activates the image on it, and it makes you connected to the representation in a way that can only happen through function and use. And this is what I call performative framing. So for example, on this wonderful vase, when liquid fills the form, the boats inside the rim will appear to float on the water. And then you have a continuous composition of the narrative all around the top. So there is a narrative happening continuously all around the top. But what I find so extraordinary about these objects is how the boats would appear to float on the water once the object is filled with water, which is the function of that object. Circular compositions happen in all kinds of ways as well, and they often create a feeling of concentration, where by placing the image in a specific position, it concentrates the feeling that we get from the image. While if the image is in oppositions to the previous one, where the image is in expansion by a reverse circular composition, then the image appears to be larger than it would otherwise. So let's have a look at the previous one as well, where there is a condensation of the image, where here there is an expansion of the image by the fact that the composition has been reversed. So directional framing happens in all kinds of cultures. I'm just showing you here 4 examples. You have a scene in the middle which is experienced from a directions, and the other 4 small ones are presented in 4 different directions all around the objects, because the objects are not static. They're meant to be seen from various viewpoints, and potters often address that necessity in the making of their work. Continuous compositions of all kinds are also very interesting. This is an example here of this vase by Dinos, where athletes are represented in various sporting activities. And you can see when you unroll the image at the bottom of my screen, it has much more of a static feel than when it is on the object itself, where the image is slightly distorted, which gives a bit of volume quality to the figures themselves. And then you can only experience one scene at a time as you go around, instead of all of them in one single glance. And this sort of cutting of the image, again, is something I call cinematic experience. Quite often the image not only represents theatrical scenes, but the representation itself, the composition of the image is theatrical, with a proscenium and a curtain and acts that begin and end, and so on and so forth. Another thing that happens a lot in Greek Attic pottery is the extension of the image beyond the frame. Instead of the frame containing the image within its edge, the image goes beyond the frame and exceeds it. And that's quite interesting as well. And we have a wonderful example of that here on a bilingual vase by Andokides, where you have figure ground reversal. You have a black figure on the left and the right figure on the right, and I will not repeat the difference between the two because we've looked at that quite closely before. There is a wonderful example here by the Neobid painter with dispersions of figure over the ground, which is left undescribed, which is ellipsis. But I bring this object up because in art history books it is often mentioned that Greek Attic pottery must by necessity reference painting compositions of the time. The problem is we have no examples of such paintings from Attic times. So this is a speculation that art historians make, but I would contest that quite dramatically, and I will use this example to show that, because having no examples of Greek paintings flat of such formal compositional complexity, how are we to say that those objects were influenced by paintings? And my argument is that the composition on those objects only makes sense on volumetric form, that on the form itself, the composition is very credible and it makes sense despite its shortcoming and its quirkiness sometimes. Well, when you unroll the image and make it into a two-dimensional, more or less painting reference, the compositions becomes really awkward and very unconvincing. So I would be willing to defend the argument that those images on pots not only are not referential of paintings, but probably were influential of subsequent development in painting, and it is the Greek Attic pottery that comes first and served as a precedent for development in art. So again, the image is in an intimate relation with the volumetric form, and the complexity of the composition only makes sense on the object itself. And I have another example of that here, of that vase, and this is its composition as an unrolled photograph. And you can see how bizarre it looks in that sense. And even if we were to recompose this as a more or less normal square compositions, it would never have the dynamic reality and the convincing presence than those various figures have when they are on a volumetric form, where the complexity of the composition only makes sense on the object itself. And there is such an image that has been created in the 18th century in England, and you can see that again to stress my theory that the image was so much more efficient on the object than it is as a two-dimensional painting reference composition on a flat surface. So there are all kinds of stories being told on Greek vases, the stories of the Trojan War, the Odyssey, and so on and so forth. I will not go into details about what is happening on those objects because that would be too complex of a subject to develop in this talk. What I want you to be aware is how the image is inserted into the object, what is the relationship between the object and the image, and how the images change and transform an experience in a specific way by its presence on an object. And that's the core of my argument. Let's look at its development in pre-Columbian America as well, because people have been putting narrative surfaces on ceramic objects all over the world throughout time. And again, it's interesting to analyze how the image and the objects had a relationship with one another. And because of its great complexity, the precedents we have in Greek Attic pottery can serve as a model for our understanding of those types of objects. But there is always a form of intimacy between the form and the surface. And you have a great example of that here in the spiral compositions where those runners are going down the mountain as they spiral around the object, for example. And those are in relations with Nazca lines. The Nazca culture of South America is quite extraordinary among many others. And I just want to make that relationship here. The same thing with the Maya in Mexico. You have here the vase on the left, which is signed by the artist. The artist Aj Masham was the first and only Mayan artist to sign his work. We don't have an artist's signature in any other art form than on those wonderful pots by Aj Masham. And you can see it depicts the 7 gods of the underworld, and the image again being experienced on the objects in fragments, in sections, and progressively over time creates a narrative in time and space that is more convincing than when the image is unrolled photographically, as is seen on the right, where it becomes a confusing jumbles of shape and forms that are not as efficient. So 2 more examples of the work of Aj Masham, because he was really one of the great artists of the classic period, and he's an artist who gained to be known more. So we find all kinds of representations of wonderful mythological aspects in pre-Columbian ceramics. Again, it's how the composition is inserted within the format, which is circular, with a band around the edge, and so on and so forth. And sometimes, a ground defines the above and the below, and the above ground and the underground, and so on and so forth. And this is a plate on the left that contains the cosmogony of the Maya. They're basically complete spiritual and religious system is painted on a dish. And you see here a transcription in graphic style on the right. Now let's move on to Italian majolica from the Renaissance, because again we have a wonderful way of addressing representational narrative scenes on ceramics. And the Della Robbia family are notable for their wonderful religious ceramic representations in mid-relief, low relief to high relief, and they were tremendously influential. There are many other artists following in their steps, like the Buglioni and so on and so forth, but Andrea Della Robbia, Luca Della Robbia, the initiator of the family and of this style, and somebody like Bernard Palissy, whose work we've seen a bit before and we will see again in the simulation aesthetics coming up next. But I really like those plates by Santo Avelli. You have a majolica painter, a painter painting a plate, looking at his model, this husband and wife, who are probably getting the dish as a wedding gift. And you have the painter of a plate on a plate, and again that conflation and correspondence between the image and the object is something quite exciting, and that will only happen within those type of art making. The piece on the right is basically based on prints that are collaged and reassembled in wonderful ways on the objects, and prints were often used as a source for those images. Prints usually coming from paintings themselves. Paintings were translated into prints, and then prints were recomposed into wonderful compositions on ceramic objects. And Francesco Santo Avelli was one of the great painters of the Italian Renaissance working on ceramic forms. And you have examples from just about all and any cities throughout the peninsula of Italy. This is an example from Urbino and an example from Pesaro, from more or less around the same time. And again, I just want you to become aware of the composition, the circular format, the relationship of the image to the form, and how all of those things within a palette of very limited color. You have yellow and black and orange, green, and blue. And so within a very small chromatic palette, wonderful thing happens. And something I have mentioned in the decorative aesthetic as well is when multiple iconic devices, heraldic, symbolic, decorative, representational, are inserted within a single composition. So within a single object, you have all of those various iconic devices, ways of putting images together that are on one object. And again, this is a precedent that I will defend happens first in ceramic history, and that has then a tremendous influence on the development of future art form all the way to the contemporary work we make today. This is an example of the work of Matthias Osterman, and he is the author of a book called The New Majolica that some of you may be curious to go further into. So there are many other traditions and forms of narratives that I want to bring up as well. This is Minai ware from Iran, from what we would call the Middle Ages, from a Eurocentric viewpoint. And again, beautiful circular compositions, relationship between banding and edges and decorative elements and repeated pattern, and some text as well sometimes. But what's interesting to me about Minai ware, which is some of the earliest overlays decorated ware in the history of ceramics, happening again in this part of the world that used to be Mesopotamia, but by the Middle Ages, the 12th century, is actually Persia and Iran, is that it flattens the interior of the space, which is actually quite a deep concave object. You have the same object here seen from the top, where the image is really flattened, and the object itself, and you can see there is quite a bit of depth and concavity to that object. So this illusion of flatness inserted into a very deep concave in three-dimensional object is something we find in those types of things. In China export porcelain, we have a lot of porcelain made in China, but influenced and inspired by European stylistic and decorative devices, as well as subject matter like Christianity, for example. And this mixing of cultures is something I find quite interesting. When a culture interprets another one, and the Europeans were interpreting China a lot, but the Chinese were also interpreting Europe, and it creates wonderful work of great charm. I want to bring to your attention the green frog service made at Wedgwood in 1773 for the Empress of Russia, where she commanded this huge dinner service, which shows 1,222 different views of England. And from those dishes, we know what England looked like at the time. Most of those scenes and views have disappeared. They've been completely changed and transformed since then. But we have an historical record of how England looked like in 1772-73 when Wedgwood and his workers at the factory painted all of those scenes. There is a different scene on each one of the object in the service that was sent to the Empress of China and can be seen at the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg today. All kinds of interesting narrative scenes can be inserted on ceramic, and domestic scenes are one of great interest as well. Again, this was made by Wedgwood. It shows domestic employment, all kinds of activities that women would have on objects that were made specifically for the use of women in a domestic context. What's interesting about this set is that it was designed by Lady Templeton in 1783. So the designer of those objects, especially at the level of surface decoration, is a woman artist. And then this is a wonderful example of the use of a print that was transferred into a ceramic surface on this dish by the use of etching, basically, and engraving that were then printed on paper and transferred onto the ware. We will look into this further on in the industrial aesthetic chapter as well. So I have discussed briefly the Blue Willow pattern, and the Blue Willow pattern comes from types coming from China originally that were reworked by Thomas Minton in 1780 in England, and it became the most popular and still produced today ceramic pattern ever in the history of dinnerware. There is many versions of the Blue Willow pattern, both made by Minton and by other factory, and it came from China originally, was transferred into hand-painted ware for a while, like this example of Delftware on the right, and then eventually became an etched print, transfer printed on ceramics when Minton followed in the development of that technique by Thomas Spode, another manufacturer around that time. So this is the source of the blue willow pattern, reinterpreted by Thomas Winton, Canton ware coming from China originally. And then all kinds of printed transfer ware were made subsequently. There is the very famous blue willow pattern, but there is a pattern called the Philosopher, another one called the Fisherman and Castle. There are dozens and dozens of them that were made. And some of the most interesting are commemorative ware that show that are contemporary with the events depicted. Pottery as the internet of the 18th century. And here you have the death of Wolfe presented in two different scenes. And the death of Wolfe happened in Quebec City in 1760, and these objects would have been made just a few months to a few years after the event and distributed all over the English-speaking world at the time. This is an example with a view of Quebec City in 1780. They were made in England for the local market and exported all over the British Empire. You have scenes of falls and so on. And what's very funny sometimes is that you have incongruent elements put together. You have a view of the Arctic in the middle of that plate, and then flowers and animals that have nothing to do with the Arctic around the edge of the piece. And those kinds of contradictions and weird juxtapositions are something we find a lot in ceramic and in ceramic history that I find quite interesting for many, many reasons and could be investigated further. I will show you a series of plates made in Ontario, in England, for the Canadian market. They were designed by John Ainsley in 1880, and they show views of Canada. Those are two views of Muskoka in Ontario. And then you have other views, people going to the Rockies, meeting with native tribes, crossing rivers, finding themselves in wilderness. And those kinds of scenes of Canada were very, very popular in England and so on. And then you have all kinds of tourist wear, souvenir wear, like this is from 1950s, showing Niagara Falls, a mixture of transfer printed image coming from photography with hand-painted colors added on to the wear. So this notion of ceramics pictorial space, how pictures are inserted within ceramic form and surfaces, is really something quite specific to the field, and I hope this serves as an introduction with the reading I'm assigning for this class. This is a wonderful example of chaotic space where you get this messy surface coming from the application of the slip on the wear over which overlays elements have been added to create this messy landscape. Something very interesting as well is the difference in pictorial space between Asian wares and European ware. In Asian ware, which I call the Oriental pictorial space, we have an emphasis on empty space. There tends to be quite a bit of empty space, and that space feels very integrated within the representation, very much part of it, and not just absence. So the white ground is integrated in the experience of the image. While when those wares came to Europe, they were imitated by European manufacturers, like at Meissen, for example. This is an imitation of an Asian form and an Asian decoration on the right. But there is independence between the figure and the ground. The figures don't feel to be inserted into the ground convincingly. They just sit on top. And the ground, the ground is completely void. It feels empty. It doesn't feel activated and integrated within the image itself. And I'm not saying that one is better than the other. I just want to make you aware of the difference between the two. You have here an example from Imari, Japan, where there is an effective use of the white ground and an integration of the white ground within the composition in a credible way. And its European copy is quite less convincing. There is much, much more of a discrepancy and a disjunction between the figure and the ground that we find much more successfully resolved on the example on the left. And this is another example here from Kakiemon, Japan, where there is beautiful integration of the white ground within the figures. while on the right, this copy of this very same object at Dupaquier factory in Vienna in 1750 shows the disjunctions between the figure and the ground and the much less convincing integration of the figure within the ground than happens on the Asian type. So there is all kinds of ways, again, images and objects can be integrated together. I really like this little T-ball where there is, again, active framing by the continuity of the image on the exterior with the image on the interior. They are not two separate spaces. There is complete physical continuity of the image from the outside to the inside of the object. And this type of sophistication, which create a very specific, not only visual, but experiential experience, is found on ceramic objects in ways that is not found in other experience of art. So often on examples from European factories like those two examples from Meissen, is that in order to emulate the use of empty space in Asian wares, they would use excessive amount of it to make a reference with Asian prototypes. But that excessive use of empty space to imitate Chinese model, again, as I've demonstrated earlier, is never convincing and is actually quite awkward, although it does makes it often very charming and specifically interesting for that reason alone. And of course, European porcelain manufacturers developed their own very original stylistic devices. For example, the use of the Baroque frame, the monochrome yellow ground, and so on and so forth. And this use of a dynamic Rococo framing where the frame itself becomes decoration and expands into the surface of the ware. And it doesn't only defines a space for an image to happen, but it also connects with the object in a way that is extremely dynamic and forceful. We will look in the next presentation on simulation in ceramics. This is an example of it, what I would call illusionistic framing. And I'll just show you this wonderful example for now because we'll be discussing it later. And yet another teapot with excessive use of empty ground to connect with precedent in China that those people were trying to emulate. And another example as a garniture, which is also a format coming from Asian models and that we've discussed previously twice actually already. So there will always be recurrent information like this throughout all the lectures I will be delivering for this class. The lectures are not independent from one another. It's by cumulatively assessing what is brought up that an exciting experience happens. I find those Four Season vases by Candler from 1755 made at Meissen's. You have winter, spring, summer, and fall as both surface image and form, and the relationship to the four elements as well: fire, air, water, and earth, the most important one possibly. So other form of framing we find, you have stable framing with edges and perpendicularity and 90-degree angles and so on the left. And you can have very destabilizing framing where the image being distributed all over the form in a rather unusual way destabilizes you. And if on the left you can go from image to image and square to square to follow the narrative on the right, that narrative is much more disjuncted and dynamic for that reason. Another form of pictorial space is the use of collage framing with overlapping elements. So this use of fragmented images, compositions of a number of images overlapping one another, again, is something that I believe happens first in pictorial ceramics in Asia and in Europe, and is a precedent to those kinds of collage development that will happen in the 20th century in art making. Other two examples of overlapping framing happening in Japan. Another thing that's quite interesting to consider is when the image appears to dissect the form, as on the right. You know, the way the image is inserted into the shape makes you very unsure of its position in space and how it is in relation with the objects. It almost becomes a window or a gap in the form, and the image can read sometimes more penetrating the form or standing in front of it more than in any other type of relations. There is certainly a disruption that happens when the image is dissecting the form, as it does into those two wonderful vases. So here you have the form that is classical, the decoration which is arabesque to a large degree, and then you have a narrative surface that is framed in a very, very specific way and in experience in a very specific way for that reason. Here are two other examples of the image penetrating the form, whereby the use of perspective on the left, the image really appears to be inside that shape instead of sitting specifically on its surface. This is the other side of this wonderful object, which is in the Victoria and Albert Museum, which shows a portrait of Albert and Victoria on one side, and then the Crystal Palace on the other side. And it's quite interesting again to realize how the frame itself, its position on the objects, the shape of the frame, and then how the image is in relations with the form to create a very exciting experience. So sometimes that experience of spatial position can be quite extreme, and the surface, the image, appears to penetrate the form so that we read the image as in the form, as inside the shape, much more than it appears to be on its surface, something that's stressed by the glossy, shiny surface, which almost appears like a glass window through which we are looking at those two images. So I'm showing you the work of some artists that are noted for their use of framing and narrative surfaces in ceramics. Anna Barlow, working at Minton at the end of the 19th century. Marc-Louis Solon, also working at Minton around the same time. You can see that he approaches it with a very different technical, material style, and creates work of a very different nature. And one thing I want to bring up to your attention that I discuss in the reading much further is all around continuous composition. I've brought that up with Greek Attic pottery before. Those are two examples from Newcomb pottery from the United States. What happens when we experience something like a landscape in the round, that the landscape is continuous all around the object? And I'm just showing you those examples. I won't go further into it. But in the reading, I explain how I perceive this experience of three-dimensionality and 360-degree experience, which is cinematic, as specific to a ceramic experience that will not happen to that degree of sophistication and complexity in any other art form. This is the work of Marie Bracquemont in France. Her husband was an Impressionist painter, and she was herself a painter. You've probably never heard of her because most of the work she did is on ceramic surfaces, and this is Impressionist ceramics from around 1860 in France. This is a painting by Marie Bracquemont as an Impressionist painter, and there are many artists of importance that have been erased from the history of art because they are women, because they come from an ethnic background that is not Eurocentric, but often also because they work in an art form like ceramics that has been depreciated by the field of art history and unappreciated for all the contribution it has made. And here you have narrative framing, where the story goes from one plate to the other to the other. And this is again the work of the wonderful decorator Ogata Kenzan, working here with his brother Agatha Corinne, who was a very celebrated painter. Most historians will know who Agatha Corinne is, much fewer will know who Ogata Kenzan is. They were both great artists. I really like those cups with, again you have interior, exterior continuity. We often tend to emphasize decoration and surface narration and all kinds of pictorial device on the exterior of objects. It's also interesting to consider their interior and the relationship between the two, which we find very convincingly on those weeds and grasses growing over water in those wonderful 5 tumblers. I also want to bring to your attention the use of propaganda in ceramics, and you have here an example from Russia and an example from China. Again, I will use those examples periodically to make a point. Another example from Russia and one from China. Ceramics used to propagate informations and political ideology and events at the time around war and famine and so on and so forth. They're very wonderful objects. But what I find very interesting in those two specifically is, as I mentioned earlier, that in Asian ceramics we have a very sophisticated and wonderful use of empty space and the integration of empty space within the composition of the image and the narrative. For some very interesting reasons, in the late 50s, early 60s, when propaganda ware was made in China, there is much more of a use of a European spatial representation academic, and we don't have that convincing and sophisticated relation between empty space and representations that we found earlier. So not only is there a change in the political system, but there is a change in the stylistic, aesthetic approach to image making that happens in China at the time. This is a plate made in China for French royalists at the time of the French Revolution, and it's just a beautiful plate with a monogram and then this urn with a branch of tree coming across it. But if you look closely, you will see the profile of Louis XVI, of Marie Antoinette and their 2 children, which are hidden into the image. So there is a secret in that image that you know to see if you are aware of the code. Now, images of pots on pots are also quite interesting. This is an example from Wedgwood on the left and from Janet Debus on the right. And I believe this is my last image for today. It's the conflation of form and object with representation seen in this Pablo Picasso corrida of the 1950s, where the oval dish has become the interior space of a large architectural space where a corrida is happening, and there is beautiful conflations between the image and the form, and a change in scale. This is a very vast space represented at a very small scale in this domestic objects, and this is a very sophisticated and extraordinary use of what happens in ceramics when 2D and 3D form and surface, image and objects come together to create wonderful works. Oops, I have a few more. This is the work of Michael Frimkes from 1963, using an Asian form with wonderful contemporary surfaces, again conflating different cultures, different times, and combining them in a very dynamic way. And the work of Grayson Perry, who basically is a follower of Michael Frimkes, whether he knows it or not, doing something similar in the contemporary world, where he uses the reflected surface of the glaze to introduce the viewer into the form itself. That's another integration of things. And I believe now this is the very last image, which is a very weird plate, which has 3 bugs and insects on the rim, and then inside 3 medallions that are connected with a ring. You have 3 different very, one in gray, one in camailleux of pink, and one in a realistic chromatic compositions, all on the same objects. And I hope that these presentations today has shown you how the complexity of ceramics can be interpreted and understood and experienced to be used in the development of further work for the future of the field. Thank you, and see you next week.